Hi everybody, welcome back to another Left Foot Media video. I apologise, it has been a long time between drinks. I know some of you are probably sitting there thinking, come on dagnabbit, subscribe to your channel and come around these here parts and I ain't finding no content. What the hell going on? I'm sorry, I'm really sorry. I have never been a full-time YouTuber. I have a young family. I have a full-time job that is very busy. And so something had to give over the last 12 to 18 months, and my ability to produce video content related to movies has just had to sort of take a bit of a back seat at this time. So I apologize for that. I'm hoping to be able to return to a bit more serious movie-related content next year. In the meantime, you'll just have to put up with the scraps that the master throws you from his tables, and you will like it. Apologies, though, in advance for that. The good news is that I'm here, and I hope that you're going to enjoy this video because I want to talk about this new movie called Barbarian. One other thing I should say, I'm in a new office space now, and so it's a little bit noisier. There are some trees outside close to my office, and it's a bit windy today. Also, the fan on my Mac is starting to get a little bit noisy today because it's a bit warmer. We're in summer here in New Zealand, so you may hear a little bit of fan noise in the background. Apologies for all of that kind of stuff. But I want to talk about this movie, Barbarian. I watched it last night, and a lot of people have been talking about this. Well, there's a bit of a hype about this. I mean, should I say a lot? I suppose there's been a bit of a hype generated about this film. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm sort of looking off to the side, it's because my notes are up here. So if you see my eyes dart over this way rapidly, it's because I'm consulting my notes. I took a few notes after watching the movie. I should say too that there's going to be a ton of spoilers in this particular video. So if you haven't seen the film Barbarian and you don't want anything at all spoiled, you're going to want to shut this video off right now, go away, watch the film, and then come back later. If you don't mind spoilers, then keep watching. You have been warned. So this is the 2022 film Barbarian, starring Georgina Campbell, Bill Skarsgård, Justin Long, among others. It's got a 7.1 at the moment, or the time of recording, on IMDb, so that gives you an indication it's got a bit of popularity. And I think ultimately, if I could give it a sort of a summary of this film, it is a reasonably well-crafted mystery, thriller, / horror film. It's the type of mystery horror film that I like and I think is actually genuine art. It's not like torture porn. It's not like the Hostel series of films where it's like, how can we shock people with the most gratuitous violence possible that we can put on screen? It's not one of those kind of films. It's more atmospheric. There is a mystery here, and I like the way it's cut together. I think as far as a film goes, it's well made, and it's kind of refreshing to see a movie that isn't just more superhero schlock. There's actually a story that's being told here. I won't call it an original story. I was about to utter those fateful words, an original story, because to be fair, this is a film that relies on previous tropes, and it's not really anything particularly new, but it is good to see more of this kind of filmmaking content coming to the fore. I wanted to make this video, though, for two reasons. One is because the messaging in this film is about as subtle as a brick to the side of the head, and I want to talk about that in a moment. There's no hiding the underlying woke subtext, I was going to say subtext of this film, and it really is. It's like a brick to the side of the head. And so I want to go through and sort of talk about the deeper meaning of this film. If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you'll know I like to talk about the deeper thought and philosophy and ideology that you see on display in a lot of movies. If you haven't been watching here, or you're new to the channel, why not hit that little subscribe button? See how I work that in like a pro. You'd think that I've been doing this forever and a day, that I hadn't taken an extended break and then suddenly come back. But there you go. I am back, baby. Enjoy this video. Enjoy this little scrap, this little morsel that I'm throwing at you from my table, and you will enjoy it, and there will be no complaints. I want to talk about that, but I also want to talk about in this review the things that I thought were just too much for my willing suspension of disbelief. Now, I'll reiterate this again, lest I be accused of just being a negative Nelly. All this guy does is complain about things and nothing more. This is actually quite a serviceable film as far as the construction of a movie goes. It doesn't have any major flaws, if you like, from a technical perspective, and there's an enjoyable little element to all of this. But there is a ton of woke ideology that's being thrown at you, and there is also, I think, ultimately a problem with a willing suspension of disbelief. Now, here are the things that I found a little bit frustrating. These were things that really pulled me out of the film. So, First of all, how the heck did this place actually get created? We are talking here, for those who haven't seen the film, about a house, and underneath that house is a labyrinth, a rabbit warren, a massive labyrinth of proper, I guess you'd say, mining grade tunnels, like the kind of tunnels that are really well made that are not going to cave in on you, and they seem to run in all sorts of directions. There seems to be some quite lengthy tunnel work here that a lot of time and effort would have been involved in, and it goes deep. So how the heck did this place actually get created? Now, to be fair, this is probably my most minor question of disbelief, because you could probably in your mind create some fanciful scenario in which this all makes sense. Well, I think this happened, and then this happened, and then while no one was watching, he was sneaking out large chunks of rock at night, which he had somehow chiseled. I'm assuming it's rock, because there don't appear to be too many structural supports like you would require if this was earth-based tunnel works. But basically, he's sneaking rock and stuff out of his house at night. No one's noticing the sounds, chipping away into the neighborhood and all that kind of stuff. I just think it is implausible, but you could in your mind probably, create a scenario in which you think, oh yeah, this all makes sense to me. Here's one thing though that the filmmakers actually do well. They don't try and come up with some hackneyed scenario to try and give you the backstory for how this labyrinth tunnel system actually got created. Now, one of the things this film does really well is actually it doesn't show you everything. You don't need to see everything. You don't need to see gratuitous violence on screen to understand that there is awful, horrible violence being done to a character. You can display what needs to be displayed without giving us the graphic gratuity of that kind of stuff. And this film, I think, does this reasonably well. So at one point, a character watches some video footage of a victim, but we don't see what they're seeing, but we hear and see enough to know that it's bad. And that's all we need. We don't need the gratuitous stuff that's there for shock factor only. The story and the presentation of these facts is enough to give us the horror, if you like, and to understand the seriousness and the gravity of what this all is. And so one of the things they don't do is they don't show you how this labyrinth was created. It gives you the basics. You know who created it. You know when the process began. You see a shovel in the corner and stuff like that. And you know what's happened here. And why I think this is astute is because if they'd given us a hackneyed backstory like a lot of films want to do these days, it would have actually made the problem of disbelief a lot worse, because it would be telling us, hey, look at this really absurd plot point. It would be telling us you need to focus in on this. By not creating a hackneyed backstory and just leaning into it and leaving us to invent in our own minds how we think this tunnel system came about, there's a pretty good chance that a lot of viewers are just going to ignore it. They're just not going to even think that it's an issue. Some people might say, well, it wasn't really a big deal for me at all. Other viewers are going to go, oh yeah, and then they're quickly probably going to, in their mind, go, oh yeah, they're probably somehow he dug it out at night and that's all that matters and blah, blah, blah. I'm not even going to go into it, right? But the moment you as a filmmaker go into it, you're forcing the audience to go with you on that journey. They didn't do that. It was very clever, because the point is that you don't then get pulled even more into the situation that is just so totally unbelievable that you are now pulled out of the movie going, hey, that's not fair, that's not going to work, this is stupid, that wouldn't happen in real life, and all those kind of things that you say in this moment. The second point of disbelief that I struggled with was the black homeless guy who's living in the water tower. It's kind of weird. He's sitting out in the open by a fire at night when we meet him in his natural environment, if you will, and it kind of doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't she, and I mean the monster lady, the monster creature from the dark recesses of the labyrinth, why wouldn't she have killed him earlier? And because she does kill him in this movie, she comes for him. He's sitting out in the open and he sort of says, well, she hasn't really come this far and, we're safe here. But then he's just told a character a few minutes earlier that it's not safe to be out at night and it's really dangerous, and she comes out of the house and roams the neighborhood at night, and it's like, well, which is it? You can't really have it both ways. You can't have a character who's literally just down the road, sitting in a very open-air environment, saying, oh, we're safe here because we're a far enough distance away, but then earlier is telling another character, our main protagonist, you've got to leave, she can't be out here at night, it's really dangerous. Kind of doesn't quite gel. Now, maybe we can make this sort of plausible deniability in our mind here, because I think there is a justification. That justification is that maybe she is not jealous, but she sees him as a threat now that he has these two, well, I guess you'd call them our main protagonists, who are now sitting around the campfire with him. So in her mind, the creature's mind, they are her children. The whole thing of motherhood, we'll get to that in a second, is a big theme here. And so they are her children, and her children have now been taken from her by this man and his campfire. And so now maybe she sees him as a threat, and that's why she has killed him. But then that raises the question, well, if that's her sort of fundamental basic logic, whereby she takes and captures people who come into her lair within or close to her nest, she takes them to be her children, that raises a whole lot of other questions we'll get to in a minute, because this is an Airbnb home. This is how the characters get there, for those who haven't seen it. They rent an Airbnb, and the house is sitting on top of the labyrinth, and then you go down into the creature's lair, and it sort of raises the question, if she's coming out of her lair at night, why hasn't she captured more people who presumably will have hired this Airbnb house? We'll get to the absurdity of that in just a second. More people surely would have hired it and would have been victims of this creature. And if she's that sort of basic in her instincts, why doesn't she just wander up the road at night? And why hasn't she taken that black homeless man and made him one of her children? Why has she left him alone? It's kind of, to me, it just didn't quite make much sense. The two other things, and these are the really big ones, is the fact that this house is still standing without any of this ever having been discovered just doesn't make any sense. Who would have bought this house? We know who's eventually ended up with the house. It's one of our protagonists, Justin Long's character, the Hollywood guy. He owns it as part of a property portfolio. But how the heck did that happen? How did it get sold in the first place? Because we know, we're introduced to the original owner, and he's the guy who created the labyrinth, and he's the guy who's kidnapping these women who become these creatures. So how the heck did this thing get sold? What were there open homes? Did people come and look? Did no one actually look in the basement when they were checking this house out? Did no one find the blatantly obvious rope in the wall that you pull on, and then that opens the door to this creature's lair? Has no one seen the creature before this? We're told it comes out at night. What's going on with this house in this random, not just abandoned neighborhood, but this totally run down, dangerous backwater Detroit neighborhood, where there's no houses around? This house just stands out like a sore thumb. And I know they were, on one sense, it's kind of, I guess you'd say it's creative. They're trying to create an environment in which people are isolated to sort of pull off the whole scheme of the plot, but then this doesn't quite make sense. And it's also sort of unclear to me why Justin Long's character would turn up and stay in that house. I get it. He's trying to liquidate some of his property portfolio because he's desperate for money, because he's been accused of being a rapist and he needs to fight a court action and all that. But why wouldn't he stay with his friends? We know he's got friends in Detroit. We meet them. Why wouldn't he actually stay with them? Why would he stay in this house in this absolutely dodgy part of town? Why would anyone have an Airbnb in this dodgy part of town? There's so many things about this house that just don't really make sense, despite the creative attempt to come up with a slightly different type of environment in the modern context where you could have isolation. And I understand that's what they're trying to do here, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't understand how this house actually got sold. And even the concept of the guy, because the guy who started this labyrinth, the victimizer, the ultimate villain, if you like, in all of this, he's still living underneath in the labyrinth. So what did he do? Sell the house and stay? Why would he sell the house? Why would a guy who's such an apex predator, like he's presented in this film, why would he put himself at risk like that? Because surely he would know that if I sell my house, then people are more likely to discover the fact that I've got this villainous lair underneath my house, and I've got women here who are my sex slaves and my prisoners that I'm breeding with. Wouldn't people find that? Surely they're more likely to find that if he sells the house. And it seems that someone who's that predatory probably wouldn't take that risk. The whole thing just pulled me out of the film, and I really struggled to get my head around. I get it. The film sort of just leans into it and goes with it, and we're sort of taking along for the ride. But it still doesn't mean that it makes a lot of sense. And that brings me to my fourth and final suspension of disbelief moment that I just sort of couldn't get my head around. And that was, why would our main protagonist, Georgina Campbell, why would she stay in this Airbnb? So first of all, why would she book this house in this dodgy, rundown neighborhood? The house looks okay, but the surrounds are not flash. And I think most people today, I think it's fair to say, would do a bit of basic research about where they're going to be staying. I certainly do. I do a lot of travel for my work. I often have to stay overnight. It is not unusual for me to book things like an Airbnb or a motel or a hotel room, and I am very aware of where I am going to be staying. And I think probably most people would be in this situation. So why would she actually book this house in the first place? But okay, let's give the plausible deniability here, because the film, I think, does a fairly good job of covering and papering over that. It's a bit paper thin, but papering over it, based on the fact she turns up at night. And at night, it's raining, it's dark. You can't really see the neighborhood surrounds. You see the house. The house actually looks pretty serviceable from the outside. You might not notice, you're distracted looking at your Google Maps, trying to get to the location. It's dark outside, it's raining. You might not notice that you've driven into a decrepit, rundown, dangerous hovel of an area. And so there's kind of plausible deniability there. But then she gets out of the house the next morning and looks around, and it's like, yeah, okay, I'm in Dodgyville here. This ain't a good place to be. It just looks like absolutely the worst possible place that you could be. It's not like, oh, the neighbor's house is a bit rubbish, I wish they'd mow the lawns. Everywhere around you, it looks like a bomb site, except for this one house, which really doesn't make a lot of sense, on top of the fact that when she goes for her job interview, she's come into town, rented this Airbnb for those who haven't seen it, so she can go to a job interview the next day. She goes to the job interview and her boss tells her, what are you doing in that part of town? You shouldn't be there. And at that point, it would have been game over. Any sane, rational person would have said, okay, I'm out of here. The locals are telling me I shouldn't be here. And the local lady who's going to be my new boss, who I absolutely adore and look up to, is telling me, what am I doing in this part of town? It's not safe. I regularly travel for my work, as I've said, and I had a situation a few years back where I booked a motel in a place where the advertising online was misleading. I arrive at the place, so I fly into town, I pick up my rental car, I drive to this motel, and I discover this place is really, really questionable. I get in the front doors through the reception area, and it looks a little bit dodgy, but I'm like, okay, give it a chance, Brendan. Don't judge a book by its cover. Maybe this is different once you get in past the reception and into the rooms. And I get into the rooms, and as I'm walking to my room, the hallways, it doesn't look good. There's stains, it's dirty. It is not looking good. It looks exactly like the kind of place where criminal activity would take place out in the open. And I get to my room, and it's really apparent. The room is not particularly clean. It's just very abundantly clear at that point that I am not in an establishment that I really want to be in. It's not a place that you would say is safe. And so what I do is I immediately go back. I don't even unpack my bag. I sit there for a few seconds, just get my head around it. I can hear some noises that sort of settle the deal for me a couple of rooms over that don't sound too good. And I think, okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back out. I'm going to say, look, I'm not staying here. And when I did that, by the way, the staff at the reception said to me, yeah, that happens quite a lot, so no worries. So clearly this is the norm. And I go back 2 minutes up the road, was a place like sort of a branded motel place. And I went there, I said, I need a room. They had a room, and it was just basic, but it was just much better. It was safer, it was clean, it was all those other things. So that's how normal people operate in the real world. There's no way you would stay. I definitely wouldn't do what she had done here. And so it kept pulling me out of the movie, and I don't think that's irrational. I don't think most people would leave themselves in that situation. They would look to try and remedy the problem. And that brings me, leaving behind all the willing suspension of disbelief, that brings me to the messaging. This film is about, as I said, about as subtle as a brick to the side of the head. The messaging is, we're woke and we're going for broke, baby. Now, this film, though, as I said, to give it credit, there's enough substance to the filmmaking here. It's not just cheap, schlocky, ideological preaching. They are doing their best to try and rep for woke, progressive ideology. They're doing their best to try and promote the hot button talking points of critical theory and postmodernism, cultural Marxism. In fact, this film touches on all, I think, I just do a quick recount. Yeah, I think it touches on all of the major critical theory, postmodernist, cultural Marxist hot button issues in one way or another. And that's why I think it makes sense that the creators of this film, who are clearly very much, this is their ideology, that they would use horror as the platform. It's like, oh, the patriarchy, it's coming to get us. Oh, racism, oh, white supremacy, oh, oh, defund the police. Oh. You know, it makes sense to me that they would use horror as their platform. So what you've got in this film, and I'll unbreak this in a little, I will break this down. I will unpack this. My words get a little bit discombobulated in this warm weather at this time of the day. It's the afternoon here in New Zealand, and it is a pretty hot day. And my office being closed out doesn't help things much at all. So please forgive me and enjoy the scrap that I'm chucking you from my table. Don't complain. Send your complaints to idon'tcare@brendanmalone.com. Don't. It's not a real website. I don't care. Sorry, I know that's facetious. Maybe the heat's getting to me. This guy's about to faint on camera. Here's what you've got in this film, though. You've got the patriarchy is the major evil. Capitalism is also an evil here. I'll unpack, as I said, this in a minute and give you a bit more detail. The traditional family and motherhood, it's an evil form of enslavement in this film. Race is also an issue here. The police are indifferent to the victims, if not downright evil. The best you could say about the police, the portrayal of the police in this film, is that they are indifferent and they are uncaring. Society is indifferent and just doesn't even know that the victims are being victimized in this film. And of course, we've got intersectionality as well in this movie. Let me explain and unpack all of that in a little bit more detail. The ultimate evil in this movie is a white male from a bygone era. Now, the era that he's come from, the film is quite clever in how it's constructed. It's sort of constructed in 3 parts, if you like to tell the story. And I kind of thought that was cool. Because when you jump to the second part, you're like, whoa, what's going on? Some people have really noticed that and said, well, that really stuck out to me. They wondered what was happening. I thought at first this might be an anthology film, and I thought, oh no, have I signed on for a movie? Because I went in not knowing anything. And I thought, have I signed on, for a film where we're going to be told 3 or 4 different stories here in short form? It's like a Twilight Zone episode. And then I thought, no, that doesn't quite make sense because we didn't really get a conclusion to the end of that previous story, but maybe that was it. That was where they're going to leave it. This guy getting his head bashed against a rock, and that was the end of that little anthology story. But then it became apparent after a few minutes what was going on, and know that there's that you're sort of jumping right outside the first story, and then you're going to come back into it in just a second. And so it was pretty clear pretty quickly what was going on, and I liked the way they did that. But then the third part, we discover how this labyrinth, this evil lair, and how these monsters have come into existence. And it's a guy who's living in Detroit in the 80s, but ultimately, despite the fact that he's in the 80s, and the reason he's in the 80s is because of the age of this character, they can't have a character who's too old for the plot, right? But here's the thing. Despite the fact that he's in the 80s, the portrayal of the neighborhood is very much, I would call it almost like a 1950s suburban domestic bliss type. You know, the utopian vision of what that supposedly could have been. You know, the white picket fences, the domesticity, the neighbors who were kind and nice, you know, well-curated, freshly cut green grass, all that kind of stuff. And so it really is trying to present, I think anyway, it's trying to present the 1950s sort of image. And I think the reason for that is because a lot of critics and a lot of the proponents of cultural Marxism and woke ideology, they target traditional Judeo-Christian conservatism, and they say, oh, it's this 1950s fiction, and it was never really that good. So I think they've sort of just relied on that trope. The guy here, though, the villain, he could not be any more white. This guy is white. I mean, he really is. You know, like, I do declare, Miss Johnson, I have not seen a man that white ever in my life. In fact, if you turn out the lights, this man will still glow and light up an entire room. This guy is white. Like, he's your evil white male. Like, if you're going to personify that and create a caricature for that, this guy is your caricature. You could say that if you're looking for this kind of thing, then the guy has been absolutely well and truly cast for the role that he has. He targets females, and this is how these monsters get created. He's a predator. He kidnaps females. He turns them into sex slaves. And what you see is this whole theme of oppression of females is a big part of this film. In fact, this theme, before we even get introduced to him, he's much later, or his monstrous creations, we see this whole theme of female oppression starting right in the opening scenes of the film. Bill Skarsgård's character and Georgina's character, they have this conversation, this happens at the very early, in fact, the opening act of the film, where they talk about the concept of male privilege, because she turns up to this Airbnb, and she's supposed to be the only one who's booked this Airbnb, but Bill Skarsgård's character has also booked it, so they've double booked it, they don't know each other, and there's this whole thing of, who is this guy? Is this guy a psycho? Is he lying? Is he a threat to me? And I was like, yeah, I know where this is going. And sure enough, it does. When they get to the conversation part, she starts talking about the fact how you've got to be extra careful as a female and you just don't know who this guy is. And by the way, this is all presented to us, as it often is, without a hint of irony. There's no sort of anyone, or no sense of anyone raising the question here, well, how did the world get to this place? Because I don't think it's fair to say it's always been this way for females, that they felt so vulnerable and alone and unprotected in society that everyone was a threat to them. That hasn't always been the norm. And no one stops to ask, well, how did we get here? That might be an interesting question. But leaving that aside, the point is there's a great irony here in this conversation, because the question itself is refuted by what they say or what comes out of her mouth next. She talks about the fact that if he had turned up, it was the other way around, so he'd got there first. So when she arrives, he's already in the Airbnb and he opens the door to her. But let's say it was the other way around and she was there first, and they actually say quite openly that she wouldn't have let him into the house. So ironically, she's the one with the privilege in that situation, because she has the nice, warm, comfortable, seemingly safe house. He's outside in the dark and the rain, and he would have to leave and go away and find somewhere else to actually stay that night, which is kind of ironic, because the whole thing is that, supposedly the privilege is with him, but ironically it's not, and he would have been in greater danger in that situation also. So yeah, there's that sort of thing going on. It starts very, very early. And then of course you also have Justin Long's character, and he is a guy who's been accused of a Me Too rape incident, Hollywood actor type, accused of rape. And we're not sure, I'll get back to this point, because at the start of the film, we're not sure, is this guy guilty or is he innocent of this accusation, this very, very serious accusation? What the villain does is he enslaves females. There is also, the victimization is also tied to the destructive forces of capitalism. There's this very interesting moment in the film where we meet the guy in the 1980s who created this evil labyrinth, and he gets into his car and a news flash comes on, and it's very, very clearly connecting him to Ronald Reagan. Now, I thought about that because I thought, well, why did they do that? Because they didn't actually need to do that at all. This guy could have been, was it Jimmy Carter who was just before Reagan? He could have been a couple of years older and started this whole thing under Jimmy Carter. He could have been a couple of years younger maybe and started this whole thing under the presidency of George Bush Sr. It didn't need to be Ronald Reagan's presidency. So I thought to myself, well, why Reagan? And then it's sort of dawned on me, well, because Reaganomics. It's the economic point they wanted to make. And with Reagan, what you have is the whole accusation around the excess of capitalism and greed. And so I think that's why it was very deliberate. They tie him to this. And so there's this subtle thing of pulling capitalism in as connecting the evil villain with the capitalist system, and very much seeing that as part of the problem here as well, because it's destroyed these neighborhoods. I don't think that's an accident that they did it that way. What he does, this guy, is he enslaves females into what you would call a form of quote-unquote domestic life. It's obviously enslavement, and they're enslaved through motherhood. He rapes these women, they have his babies. This has been going on for a long time now, by the way, too. We'll come back to that point in just a second. This critique of motherhood, of family life, of marriage, this has been around for many decades in militant feminist thinking that sets up this power struggle between men and women. And they have often compared marriage and family life and motherhood, they've put it on a par with rape. And so it's not at all surprising to see this very typical ideological symbolism being employed by this film. It's a form of enslavement. These people have been trapped, and the woman that he enslaves are his victims, but they are also monsters. They become monsters. Again, what is this? Well, in woke ideology, like I said, this is like a subtle brick to the side of the head on a warm, sunny day. This is internalized misogyny. These are women who have embraced and accepted the misogyny of the white male patriarch, and they have become monsters. They have internalized it, and they defend the patriarchy, and they defend this misogyny and actively participate in it. So in other words, any female who doesn't go along with the whole, I hate marriage, I hate motherhood, the patriarchy is like totally oppressing me. Anyone who doesn't buy into that is somehow, they're accused of being a simpleton or a victim, and they are a victimizer themselves, but they're an idiot. They've been pulled into misogyny. They have an internalized misogyny that's captured them, and now they have become the monsters because they are propping up these evil white men and helping them to perpetrate their victimhood. But they don't realize, they're too silly to see that they're also victims in all of this. No one stops to ask these mums about whether or not they might actually be happier living the lifestyle of motherhood and family life. It's always the simpletons, and they're trapped and all the rest of it. And this is where the whole thing of this has been going on, as I said, for several generations now, generations. This is systemic. This is a system of oppression that's been going on, and is really it's inbred. It's literally inbred into this little community, if you like, if you want to call it that. And it's very much it's been going on for quite some time, for some number of decades now. And this guy has been inbreeding with the baby. So, creates has a sex slave, gets her pregnant, and then is inbreeding with the child that he's creating. And that's what gives rise to these monsters. And so that's the whole idea of the systemic oppression, that's been going on, and it's deeply ingrained and all the rest of it. His white female monster victim. So this is a victim of his. This is one of his victims who is the main monster in this, who is pursuing these people and is keeping them captive. She's a female. She's a monster. Literally is a monster. She treats women of color with paternalism. She's like, "You're my baby, baby, baby." There's a scene I had a little chuckle at, which she's trying to say the word baby. And she's been schooled by one of those how-to video guides about how to do parenting and motherhood that he got for one of his victims. And it's been there for decades. And they're watching this video, and she's taking her cues from this, "You're my baby." And so it's this black career woman. So the main protagonist, the hero in all of this, is a childless career woman of color who works in the media for an obscure art house documentarian. I mean, it couldn't get any more subtle. I wonder what they're trying to tell us here. And of course, the white internalized misogyny monster has this paternalism. "Oh, you're my baby, and won't let her go and let her find her freedom as an adult in the world. The other genuinely good male victim, we'll get on to Justin Long's character in a minute, but this is Skarsgård's character. He's also an artistic liberal fringe guy, and so again, he's also a victim in all of this. You can see where this is going. The blokes who are the villains are the normies, basically, or the blokes they're really villainous, or they're the other dude is just, he's one of the liberal elites. I mean, there's no good conservatives at all in any of this. The police then refuse to take her seriously, and you've got to talk about this white cop. There's two police officers in the car that show up to respond to her phone call. There's a white cop who sits there in the background, doesn't say a word. He's just sitting there menacingly, and what you get is a very clear vibe that this guy is actually the guy who's calling the shots. And so the black cop, who is actually doing all the talking in this scene, he's kind of the lackey. He's not really empowered. That's the presentation. That's the vibe I got, and I think that was deliberate. This white guy who's sitting there with all the power. Sure, he might be teamed up with a black guy, but we've already talked about internalized misogyny, so why not talk about internalized racism, where you've got a police officer of color who's treating other people of color badly because he's internalized his racism. He's part of the system. I really couldn't help but notice that. I think this, by the way, is probably the point where the police show up. I believe this is probably the weakest as far as writing and direction and acting. And I don't think it's so much acting. I think it's more the direction and the written material that they're working with at this point. I think this is the weakest point in the film, for me personally anyway. because this moment just felt so badly contrived. Other stuff, sure, there is willing suspension of disbelief, and some of it really does strain credulity, I think, like I've already said. But this was different. This is a situation whereby she's acting in ways that don't really correspond with reality and who that character has been, I think, up until that point. So if I was law enforcement in their situation, dealing with this young lady, and she acted around me the way she did with them, I would side with them. I think they did the right thing. You've got this woman who is disheveled, who is dirty. She looks like a crack user. She doesn't have any of the things that you would expect someone to have who wasn't a crack user. Like, doesn't appear to have a car, has got no phone, is disheveled. You know, she looks like a crack user in a rundown neighborhood full of crack users, and she's ranting and raving at the cops about a monster that's living in a labyrinth beneath this house. And that's not really the big issue. The big issue, though, is the way that she talks to these police officers in this really entitled kind of way. And she gets angry with them in ways that don't really make sense, even if you take account of the sort of the situation she finds herself in and the serious level of victimization and threat to her personally at that moment in the plot. It still seems like she's acting out of character at this point. And then she acts in an entitled kind of way. She yells at them. And then also she doesn't do things that her character surely would do. Like, she doesn't seem to understand in that moment how to talk to police officers properly. And it just doesn't seem believable to me that that character would suddenly be that type of character. That's not really how she's been in the rest of the film. And I get why they've done it, because what they need is this very contrived moment where you have the police turn up. It's a typical trope in these kind of films. A supposed rescuer comes to the rescue but then walks away and leaves you to the monster. It's a typical Hollywood or typical horror trope, if you like. But here's the thing. They're also trying to make this political point. So you've got the situation happening in the movie where they want the law enforcement there because they want to use that trope in that moment, but they don't want the law enforcement involved any further in the story. Because if they get involved, it's game over. This monster gets shot, the whole thing gets unveiled, and that's the end of the story. They don't get to have the ending that they want. And so what they need is the law enforcement to turn up, because it does make sense that a woman in her situation would actually go and find a phone and ring the police. That part makes sense. And then you've got them turning up and you've got a problem. Well, we don't want them hanging around. What do we do? How do we get rid of the police? And they come up with this absurd contrivance, and they create this whole thing where she seems like a lunatic, because she does act like a lunatic, and then they get another call and they leave. They don't do the basics of policing. Now, they're trying to make a political point. I'm sure of it. I'm absolutely sure of it, given the rest of this film. They are trying to make a political point here. And the political point, of course, is that the police are indifferent to the plight of these people, the poorer classes and people of colour, and they don't take them seriously, and they're a threat, and, you know, the whole defund the police and all that kind of stuff, right? It's all going on at this moment in the story. But I think there were much better, more logical ways to do this. All they needed was to have her act rationally, to have the police turn up and then be prepared to do regular law enforcement work, but give them a good reason to be called away. Because as far as I'm concerned, that scene, she's lucky that she didn't get arrested and taken off and put into some sort of psych ward for an evaluation, because her character was just acting really, really weirdly, and it just, none of that worked. For me, that was a very weak contrivance. The point, though, is what they're trying to sell you here is this idea that law enforcement it's not your friend if you're a person of colour. They're hitting that talking point. And this brings us to the issue of intersectionality, which is, you know, a big part of this film. There's a lot of victims in this film, including women, but it's ultimately the woman of colour who is the primary victim in all of this. This is Kimberly Crenshaw's intersectionality. This is what this is. The whole notion that there are layers of oppression, there are levels of hegemonic privilege that you can possess, and on the flip side, if you don't possess those things, there are levels of victimization that you can experience. So there is the victimization of being a person of color, but then there is also, coupled with that, the victimization of being a woman. That's another layer of victimization. This is exactly what Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in her 1989 essay, where she invented this phrase, intersectionality, and it sort of took off from there. And there is an interesting little parallel here, because this film takes place in Detroit, Motor City, and it's run down. A lot of the industry is left. And in her essay, the example she uses to sort of try and hammer home her point, she's literally, when she talks about intersectionality, she is literally thinking of a crossroads, an intersection in that essay. And she's talking about this example of a group of black women who were working for General Motors. And General Motors had a seniority firing policy. So, in the 70s, economically, things get a bit tough in the States, and a lot of these big industries, they start firing people, and they have a seniority firing policy. And so what that means is if you were last hired, you are first to get sacked. Those who have been there the longest, who are the most senior, they are safer. They stay till the very end until the plant or, the corporation can no longer afford them. And they're the last ones to be sacked, though, to be let go. And these black women, because they were the last to be hired, they were the first to be let go when the economic downturn hit. And she says what this means is that these women are grappling with not just the fact that they are people of colour, but also the fact that they're women. So they've got intersecting layers of victimhood here. And so that the fact that General Motors, and this is set in Detroit, I thought that was an interesting. I don't think that's on purpose. I could be wrong. I don't think that's on purpose. But it could be an interesting little connection. By the way, that's the rain. Yes, you can hear it started to rain now. So we've got hot, rainy weather. So I expect there might well be a thunderstorm any moment now. But the point is that, you've got intersectionality. And in this film, she is our main protagonist in this movie, the lady who's come for the job interview, played by Georgina Campbell. I was desperately searching my notes for her name there, sorry. She's the greatest victim in all of this. So Bill Skarsgård, he's also a victim. He dies relatively quickly early on in the film. The guy who started all of this evil, the guy from the 1980s, we'll call him Mr. Cracker, the guy who was so bright and white that you could light a neighborhood at Christmas time just by having this guy stand in your front yard. He gets to commit suicide. He shoots himself, and what that is indicative of is he gets a very quick ending ultimately, but he never faces justice. There is no accountability for him in all of this. Justin Long's character, he actually victimizes our main protagonist. He actually throws her off the water tower to try and buy himself some time to escape. By the way, I think that is one of the best plot moments in this film. I think it's a great piece of writing, and I'll tell you why. Because basically what we've got here is a character who is accused of a Me Too rape, and it's still not clear whether or not he's guilty of this rape. There's no compelling evidence put to us to show that he is actually guilty, that this isn't something else, misunderstanding or whatever it might be. It's not clear until we get to the water tower, in my personal opinion. Because on that water tower, it's got nothing to do with rape, but what he does is, before he gets to the water tower, there's this moment sort of sitting around the fire. He accidentally shoots our main protagonist, by the way. And it's understandable at that point. He thinks she's maybe a monster coming to get him. I saw that coming from a mile off, by the way. And then he helps her out, and then there's this whole thing of, am I a bad guy? And he's sort of, you can tell he's really thinking about the rape as well. He's not just thinking about this woman that he's just shot, who's sitting around the campfire with him. He's also thinking about the rape. It's so blatantly obvious that's what's going on. And then what does he do? He gets to the top of the water tower and he answers the question very handily for us. Am I a bad guy or am I a good guy who did a bad thing? He answers the question very clearly when his instincts tell him to take this innocent female and throw her off the water tower so the monster will be distracted and you can save yourself. Now that tells you everything about this man's character, and that tells you he absolutely raped this other woman. His character is betrayed in that moment. The answer is very clear. No, he's not a good guy who did a bad thing. He's a bad guy who does bad things, and his first instinct is to treat other people as objects in his own designs. They are objects for his gratification. They are objects for his own fulfillment. He wants to be saved. That's his desire. He will take this woman and he will use her as an object in that scheme. He literally throws her off the side of the water tower like a piece of trash. That's what he thinks of women. That's what he thinks of people. That's why we know in that moment he's guilty of rape. Now, there was something interesting going on before that, in the lead up to that moment, where I thought they might actually redeem this character. Because as I said, he starts having this conversation with himself, am I really a bad guy? And I thought they were going to do something really, really good here, and they were going to have a redemption arc for this character. But then I thought to myself, no, don't be stupid, Brendan. There'll be no redemption arc for this character. This is a bloodthirsty, revolutionary ideology with no mercy. That's what cultural Marxism, critical theory, postmodernism is. There is no mercy. You're always guilty. You're born with the original sin of maleness or whiteness or whatever it is. There can be no redemption. And so this guy's not going to be redeemed. He's actually going to be the ultimate villain in all of this, or one of the ultimate villains in all of this. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. By the way, this particular plot, there's an interesting and I thought very obvious parallel to the H.G. Wells story, The Time Machine, because in the H.G. Wells story, The Time Machine, the main protagonist in that travels forward into the future. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this already. And there are basically two groups of people living on the Earth in the future. There are the Eloi, and they live above ground, and they're almost like this sort of utopian hippie commune type society. This is very much Enlightenment liberalism here. For those who don't know, H.G. Wells was very much a proponent of that. He was very much, what would you call it, an iconoclast of conservative tradition, and he was in a long type, a very promiscuous sexual infidelity, an open marriage, they called it. He was in an open marriage. One of his long-time sexual affairs was with Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, and they were both big time into eugenics. And one of the big themes in The Time Machine is this whole thing of it's a modern future where he's imagining what sort of evolution might have happened in society. So big proponent of eugenics. For those who don't know, eugenics comes out of the work of Francis Galton, who is the modern form of eugenics. We've got, the idea of eugenics further back, but the modern eugenics movement comes off the back of Sir Francis Galton. Sir Francis Galton is the cousin of Charles Darwin. He takes Darwin's work because he thinks Darwin's Origin of Species and The Descent of Man gives a justification. Well, if nature prefers fitness, then why can't we help nature out? And we'll just breed a better version of humanity. We'll use our science and our power to do that. And so eugenics and evolution were very connected. And so it's not surprising to see this in The Time Machine. But you've got these Eloi creatures. They live this sort of this original sort of state of humanity. This is very much drawing on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the Enlightenment thinkers, who has this idea of this original state of humanity that is actually good, and it's only the imposition of society on top of the human being that actually corrupts the human being. So it completely flips tradition on its head, which is that we are born corrupt and we need to be aware of our sinfulness. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Oh, the fame, the money, it's gone to that guy's head. That's a way of explaining that our proclivity. This is why The Lord of the Rings is such an important story. It explains the tendency, the pull towards evil that every human being has to grapple with, the pull towards selfishness and self-gratification, even at the detriment of others. And so Rousseau turns it all on its head. No, the original state of man is good. It's why you see a lot of talk about today. This builds on the back of Rousseau, how supposedly childhood is wiser and better than the older people. They're to blame. You have stolen my childhood. That's you old people have destroyed our future. Us wise, youthful people, you should give us the vote when we're 12 years of age because we know what's best. All that kind of stuff. That's very much a byproduct of Rousseau's philosophy and outworked in the modern era. And so it's no mistake that the Eloi in The Time Machine are also a very childlike group of adults, but they live this sort of original state of humanity existence. And then these other creatures, they are called the Morlocks, and this is the direct parallel. The Morlocks are these deformed monsters who live underground in the darkness, and that's why they are deformed, and they come out and they terrorize. They come out at night to terrorize the Eloi, and they take them, and every now and then they kidnap one and they eat them and all that kind of stuff. And so these monsters who live in the dark, who come out at night, they're totally deformed, and they're the real threat to this sort of utopian society and to the well-being of society. It's really not subtle. H.G. Wells hated Christianity, not a big fan of Catholicism. I think from memory he was kind of quite open about the fact, or didn't make it particularly subtle, that there's a parallel between the Morlocks and the Catholics and their morality destroying our sort of state of life. But what you've got is that clear parallel here in this story. These deformed monsters who live underground and they come out at night to hunt people. It's all there. Now, of course, our main protagonist, she has to survive in the end because this is the way of this particular ideology, and she has to kill the monster. And what is the monster? Well, the monster is motherhood. and it is tradition with its internalized misogyny. And you have to kill that, destroy it to gain your freedom. And so we literally have, again, about as subtle as a brick to the side of the head, we have this scene where the monster is cooing, oh, my baby, over this woman, and she, boom, pops her in the head with a gun and kills her. And then to really hammer home the point, just in case, folks, you didn't get the message, here it comes, the message. Here it comes in full glory. She then stands up as the credits roll, and we see her, the film ends, all the males are now dead, motherhood has been killed, and she, this childless career woman, is walking down an open road, leaving all the dirty, filthy capitalist ruin behind her. And as she embarks on a new day, the new day is literally dawning. The sunlight is dawning behind her as she walks off into this new day to start her new career in the arts as a career woman, a childless career woman. I mean, it is really unsubtle. The ultimate irony, though, just to finish with in all of this, the ultimate irony, though, is that in actual fact, none of this would have happened if this world had been populated by traditional men of virtue, who actually showed authentic self-giving love and care and nurture and protection for women. None of this would have happened. And even if you've got this monster, because being a conservative, I know that we don't live in a utopia. And anyone who thinks you can have a utopian world is someone to be very, very cautious of. When you're younger, we have that naivety and we think we can build the brave new world. You can't. That always ends badly. You've always got to break a few eggs to make an omelette, just imprison a few people, take away a few rights here, maybe even send them to the gulag or maybe execute them. And if we just execute the right number of people, we'll get the balance right and we'll end up with this brave new beautiful world. And so when you're younger, you're a bit naive to stuff like that. But being a conservative, I know that that's not possible and that is not realistic. So it's quite conceivable you'd have a man of evil, like our crackerjack man from the 1980s, 1950s, bright white man, who could do evil. But then in our current timeline and where the movie's actually set, all it would have taken was for Justin Long's character to be a man of virtue, to be on top of that water tower and to actually sacrifice himself in an act of total self-giving love and virtue and nurturing care and protection for the dignity of our female main protagonist. And so if he'd sacrificed himself instead, like he'd thrown himself off the tower and then the monster had gone after him, then the whole situation would have been the exact opposite, and he could have saved our female through this beautiful Judeo-Christian tradition of virtue and self-giving love and protection and nurture. And so that's the irony in all of this. But no one's really going to care about this because this message is trying to sell you the ideology. I will give it this. This is one of the better attempts that I've seen in a while to try and sell you that particular ideology. The packaging it's presented in around it is actually pretty competent and it's pretty well made. And there's enough of a story here for it to be enjoyable. You can sort of switch off. No one's superficial. No one is like a hollow man character who's just there to preach at you. It's done a little bit more cleverly than that. But at the end of the day, I think the ideology is still, it's flawed, fundamentally flawed in lots of ways that we don't have time to get into in this episode. I just wanted to sort of highlight the deeper ideology that was at play here. As per usual, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this little morsel from the master's table. There will be no complaints. Anyone who dares deign to offer a complaint will be brought forward for 20 lashes at dawn. Enjoy what I have to give you. So apologies again, I have not been as active on this channel as I would have liked to have been. I'm hoping actually to review the Rings of Power. Several of you have asked me for that, so I'm going to try and do that. There's lots we could say about that. And there's other things I'd like to talk about too, but please rest assured there is some specific movie-focused content. I've spent the last couple of weeks doing a bit of forward planning for next year, and I'm actually going to be producing some movie-focused content, some new stuff next year. So that is coming. But in the meantime, it is what it is. I've got a young family, I'm a busy guy, and I can only do what I can do. If you like this sort of content, and you also like, some of you will be aware of the other content, the cultural commentary. What's commentary? Don't even know what that is. Total made-up word. But the cultural commentary from a Judeo-Christian, natural law, conservative perspective. I'm an old school conservative in the mold of Edmund Burke. And if you like that kind of stuff, I still produce a weekly patrons-only podcast that focuses on those kinds of issues and sort of addressing sort of current affairs. And also there's a free-to-air episode that happens once a week as well. And you'll be familiar with my live stream video show with one of our local New Zealand MPs, members of Parliament, another guy called Elliot Aikili, who's a conservative commentator. So if you like that kind of stuff and you want to support the work, you can do that at patreon.com/leftfootmedia. A huge thank you in advance. If you're not a subscriber to the channel, you enjoy this video and you want more of this kind of stuff, then check out my other videos and make sure that you subscribe. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, live by goodness, truth and beauty, not by lies. And I will see you next time on Left Foot Media.